Welcome everybody to Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. My name is Matt Borders. I'm the president of the Roundtable. We have a fantastic speaker for you this evening, but before we get started, I do want to let everybody know we've had some more preservation news come out, so keep an eye on our Facebook page in regards to some of the issues going on around Manassas National Military Park. And we're going to continue to keep you updated regarding some of the preservation threats coming into Frederick County as well. No new news on that front, but I just want to keep everybody abreast when we can. But we have had some new information regarding the issues going on near Manassas. They're going to be putting out not only additional information about the data center that's potentially coming in there, but some of the fights that is going against it. And I'm going to be talking a bit about that in next month's newsletter as well, just so everybody is aware. But I do want to get into our speaker this evening because we do have a fantastic one. We have Chris Bryan here with us, and I was very fortunate to actually be leading a program that Chris was able to join us on a couple months back for the Antietam Institute, and he was very helpful with his insights. We're going to be looking at one of my favorite corps in the Army of the Potomac, one that doesn't get enough love, at least in my opinion, the 12th Corps, and specifically looking at their actions from Cedar Mountain up towards the Battle of Antietam. So, turn it over to Chris. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a great venue you have here, too. All right, so as Matt said, we're going to be talking about the first half of my book, which gets what becomes the 12th Corps, at the time the 2nd Corps Army of Virginia, from its formation up into the start of the Maryland campaign. And we have here's a nice Edwin Forbes drawing of Cedar Mountain. It's actually a pretty good drawing. And I'll talk about it a little bit more later. The Army of Virginia was created on June 26th. 1862, on basically the same day that Gaines Mill is happening down here around just outside of Richmond. And the commander from the Western Theater that's put in charge of this army is Major General John Pope. He had some successes out west at Island Number 10, New Madrid, and Lincoln brought him west to basically to lead the three units, their corps at the time, that had operated sort of independently and not very successfully in the valley in spring of 1862. So the idea is to bring them under some coordination. So as I said, it's 3 corps that make up this army. The 1st Corps Army of Virginia is commanded by Franz Sigel, and it had been John C. Fremont previously commanding this corps. And this will ultimately become the 11th Corps in the Army of the Potomac. And they're stationed up here at Sperryville. The 3rd Corps, Army of Virginia, soon to be the 1st Corps, Army of the Potomac, was commanded by Irvin McDowell, and he had 2 divisions, one at Waterloo Bridge, the other one at Fredericksburg, along kind of guarding the Rappahannock. And then the 2nd Corps Army of Virginia, as the topic tonight, is commanded by Nathaniel Prentice Banks. Banks was a political general. He had been the governor of Massachusetts, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and he had been a know-nothing politician, and he was a Republican after that. And his Republican connections got him to the point of being one of the highest-ranking major generals in the Army of the Potomac without having any real experience. One person I'd like to point out, though, is this tall colonel hovering over his shoulder. That's John S. Clark, and he pops up a few times through the book. I'm not going to talk about him too much tonight, but he is pretty important for some intelligence gathering throughout the campaign. And so I just want to point out really quickly the situation here. So, and the 2nd Corps actually goes up to Little Washington. I failed to mention that. Pope's intent, and he tells his commanders, is to be able to concentrate his forces within 24 hours, either for a drive on Gordonsville, which is right here, and that's a rail hub, important for the supply for Lee's army around Richmond, or in the event of Confederates moving on Fredericksburg to concentrate and go into their flank. And all right. So I mentioned them being at Little Washington. This is another Forbes drawing of Little Washington. It's of a grand review that takes place on the 28th of July, about a week or so after they get there. They start accumulating in Little Washington in kind of dribs and drabs between July 17th and July 19th. They go through a lot of drill, kind of extensive drill, and then they have a mock battle here where everybody forms into hollow squares, all the regiments, and Banks' cavalry escort charges each of the squares. And one of the chaplain for the 2nd Massachusetts refers to it as sham battles. This is actually a really interesting day. There's a lot of information on this battle, or excuse me, on this review, and so I'm able to kind of return to this after introducing historical figures and regiments, brigades, and things, and then draw it back to this because there's actually a lot going on. There's Banks and his staff here. So it's not exactly Waterloo, but it's kind of interesting. All right, so I'm going to give you a little background on the leadership of each brigade and division. So the 1st Division is commanded by Alpheus Williams. He was, if anybody knows anything about Alpheus Williams, you know he didn't get to Major General until the very end of the war. He was a little bit bitter about that. And he should have been made a Major General long before that point, because there are a lot of other people, including on this slide, who got to it before him, who maybe shouldn't have. But he was dependable, steady general. At Antietam, he's a little anemic, but on the whole, he's a good general. His 1st Brigade commander is Samuel Wiley Crawford. Crawford was an 1846 Penn Medical School graduate. He was an Army surgeon in the pre-war years, almost entirely out west. There was one episode in a legation to Mexico where they actually went on a geological expedition to a volcano in Mexico, so that's kind of neat. But he spent his time out west, and then in 1860 he took a billet at Fort Moultrie, which turned out to be very fortuitous for him, because when that garrison transferred to Sumter, he went with it, of course, and he volunteered to be a battery commander at Sumter during the bombardment, and got a lot of notoriety at the beginning of the war for that. He then transferred to the infantry and was a major in the 13th U.S. Infantry, served on Rosecrans' staff in Western Virginia in the fall '61 and early spring of '62. And by March, he was a brigadier general, and he transferred into this unit under Banks without a command. He was supernumerary, just in time for 1st Winchester. And Banks was happy with his performance and put him in command of the 1st Brigade, supplanting the 28th New York's former colonel, Dudley Donnelly. Donnelly went back to the 28th New York, and he was a popular officer and pretty conscientious. The 3rd Brigade commander was George Henry Gordon. He was an 1846 West Point graduate. That's a famous class. Stonewall Jackson, George McClellan, Jesse Reno, a few others that are pretty important. He served in the Dragoons under Bull Sumner in the Mexican War, brevetted twice, wounded twice. He fought a pair of Mexican guerrillas on a bridge. He served then at the western in the frontier until 1854, resigned his commission, went to law school at Harvard, and then practiced law in Boston until the war broke out. He applied for and received the permission of Governor Andrew and the president to raise the 2nd Massachusetts basically in the style that he wanted to. And that involved him picking the officers instead of the enlisted men picking the officers, which happened sometimes in the other regiments. He equipped them, and there's a great deal of discipline in the 2nd Massachusetts, and they're well known for it. His whole brigade, when he took over this brigade in the spring of '62, was also well known for its discipline. He was not very liked by the 27th Indiana, and he was not very well liked by Nathaniel Banks, and he didn't like Banks either. They did not get along at all. He wasn't very tactful either, which probably didn't help his career too much. I think the best analog that I can come up with for him in the Civil War is on the Confederate side, and that's D.H. Hill. Kind of prickly, but knew his business, and it didn't help his career too much. So. And this is the set of units that fought at 1st Winchester and had that kind of bad march back to Williamsport. Okay, the 2nd Division just strung together right before Cedar Mountain. The only units that had seen any kind of combat before were those Ohio regiments in Geary's brigade, and of the whole corps, they were the only units to have ever had any kind of victory, and that was at Kernstown. And then they fought at Port Republic, and they actually had some success in Western Virginia too, early in the war. The rest of these units had been on railroad duty and other things like that, so they hadn't really done much. So of these officers, everybody but Geary was a West Pointer. Everybody but Greene had served in the Mexican War. Henry Prince had served in the Seminole and Utah wars on either side of the Mexican War, during which he was severely wounded. Talk for an extra moment about Greene. He doesn't really come up in this part of the narrative, but he's very important later on. He was 6 years Robert E. Lee Sr. He missed the Mexican War, and he graduated early enough that he got out not long after he was commissioned. He did engineering and garrison duty in New England mostly, and then he got out and did civil engineering in New York up until the start of the war. But he's pretty important later on. Okay, so as I mentioned, they went to Little Washington, the 2nd Corps. En route to Little Washington, 2 regiments of Crawford's brigade head down to Culpeper, and they join John Hatch's cavalry brigades. It's the Corps' cavalry brigade, and basically that's their assignment. And they're down there under Dudley Donnelly's command. So Hatch gets orders from Pope to head on a cavalry raid, to head down to Gordonsville and tear up the track to the east of Gordonsville. And if he gets done that, he tells them this later, then head on down to Charlottesville and wreck some track there. And if you can keep going, go to Lynchburg and destroy the canal down there. So Hatch gets delayed before he even starts, and then he decides to take these infantry regiments along with him on his cavalry raid, and to take some artillery with him too. And he gets slowed down quite a bit. There is a lot of rain, and it messes the roads up a bit, but he's also has infantry tagging along. And it's basically a disaster. And so he's supposed to be down here on he's supposed to have left on the 14th and be tearing up this track. Stonewall Jackson and his division and Ewell's division show up on the 15th in Gordonsville on the track that was supposed to be destroyed by Hatch. It takes a few days for Pope to actually find out what's going on, and he's furious. They end up doing this circuit and coming back to Culpeper. A couple of his cavalry regiments do come down this way as well. But they get back on the 21st of July, and then Pope tells Hatch to go out again to do a different raid. That fails too, and now Pope's thoroughly dissatisfied with Hatch, and he sends Hatch off to an infantry brigade in McDowell's Corps. So he'll show up at South Mountain and Antietam in that capacity. At South Mountain. So, but what happens as a result of that is Pope pulls John Buford, Major John Buford, out of the Inspector General's office and puts him in charge of this brigade, this cavalry brigade, and sets him on a path to Gettysburg. So maybe one of the best things John Pope ever did.
Maybe the only good thing.
Yeah. So On the 24th, the rest of Crawford's brigade comes down here to Culpeper. Crawford comes with, takes over the detachment, and then Pope gets increasingly sort of dissatisfied with what the activity on the front, what he's hearing of reports of what's out in front of them, and he begins coaching Banks more and more urgently. That eventually rolls downhill, and Banks starts coaching Crawford too, and he sends John S. Clark down there to see what's going on as well. Eventually, Crawford does a raid down in south of the Rapidan. He takes a couple of cavalry regiments and goes down to Orange Courthouse. Those two cavalry regiments get into a little fight with the 7th Virginia Cavalry. They get the better of them, and then get some prisoners, come back. John Clark questions those prisoners. So Pope decides to start concentrating on August 7th to begin his movement on the 6th. So Banks, the balance of Banks' corps is to head to Culpeper, as is Ricketts' division is to head to Culpeper. Sigel is to follow. He gets delayed by some, as Pope called it, misapprehension of his instructions. And so he shows up a little bit too late to take part in the battle. It's extremely hot this week. It's in the 90s. People actually die on the march to the battle. And it slows things down. It takes 2 days for them to get down here to Culpeper. And then on the 8th, the day that they make it, the evening of the 8th, they make it into Culpeper, Crawford gets told to go down here. He's meeting up with George Bayard's cavalry. It's the brigade from Irvin McDowell's corps. And because Bayard's been doing a holding action because of all of this business down here. So the day after Banks starts moving and Pope's army starts moving, Jackson starts moving. And so he's moving on the 7th. And they move very slowly. And it's not just the heat. The instructions for the second day of March is for A.P. Hill to wait in Orange Courthouse for Richard Ewell's division to come through, and he's supposed to follow Ewell. Ewell doesn't come through. There was a change in orders, and Ewell goes a different direction. Nobody tells A.P. Hill this, and A.P. Hill stand there in the square in Orange waiting, and eventually Jackson's division comes through and goes. They're supposed to be third in line. They go through. Their trains go through, and then A.P. Hill follows after that. Jackson, of course, is not best pleased with this, and he's not a patient guy. So this starts their relationship off on a bad foot, and Hill ends up being strung out until the battle's well underway, and it creates a bit of a problem. Oh, one more thing. So Beverly Robertson's cavalry is disappointing to Stonewall Jackson in general. But they're out here basically covering Richard Ewell's left flank on this march. And what he does, though, is somehow convinces Buford around Madison Courthouse that the main thrust is coming in that direction. And Buford's sending these messages back to Army headquarters, and that creates a sort of important impression that you'll see here in a second. Because if you see the path here through Madison Courthouse, and you have other units coming this way, there's a road that goes through James City to Colburn Tavern right here. It's this road right here. So when Ricketts comes down here, he gets parked at Colvin's Tavern and pretty much stays there throughout the battle. And that's a defensive mechanism against getting flanked by Stonewall Jackson. But Ricketts is not a part of this battle. And to the great ire of everybody that marches past them and notices that they're not in the battle by the time it's over and going really badly. So, like I said, Crawford's brigade had come down here the afternoon before, and they're lining Cedar Run. So this is Cedar Run, as is this. Cedar Mountain's here. And here's the Confederates coming up. Beverly Robertson and Bayard facing off. Jubal Early's the 1st Brigade, infantry brigade in line following, and they eventually drive off Bayard. Um, the Federals, as they're coming in, Gordon is the first brigade in line on the 9th of August. When he shows up, there's a Brigadier General, Benjamin Roberts, who's sort of on the field as a sort of plenipotentiary for John Pope. Gordon sees him. Banks isn't there yet. And Gordon's keeping his eye out for good ground. And he sees this high ground over here by this brown cottage and says to Roberts, well, I think it would be a really great thing for us to anchor our right over there on that high ground. And Roberts agrees with him, and Gordon goes over there. The problem is nobody ever tells Banks, and Banks thinks Gordon is much closer than he is. And there's kind of a gap in between. And then the final thing here is there's a signal station out here on Thoroughfare Mountain. And they send that Confederate cavalry is surrounding them and that they're threatened. And so what ends up happening is the 28th Pennsylvania, very important regiment at Antietam, is sent over there. It's a 15-company regiment, very big. They'd never been in a real engagement or any kind of major engagement yet. And so they go sort of alone and unafraid out here, and they hear the battle going on, and they're thinking, okay, well, do we come back? But they end up going to Thoroughfare Mountain and occupying it, and Geary's brigade really could have used that 800-900 men from that regiment. Okay, so back to this Forbes drawing. It's from the perspective of right around here. And so you see the mountain off to the left. You see the Hudson House. Well, actually, there are two Hudson houses, but it's this one right here. And if you look really closely, there's a signal corpsman on top of that structure, which is pretty cool. Wheat fields over here. The cornfields are over this way. So I'm going to show you over here, though. This is the Orange Culpeper Road. Orange is this way. Orange is this way. Culpeper's this way. It's mostly a north-south road, but right here on the battlefield, it turns almost east-west. You have the Mitchell Station Road and the Crittenden Lane leading to Crittenden House on top of two ridges. And you get low ground in between because of this rivulet. Cornfields in between here, wheat field here, and a recently cleared field that's a scrub field, and basically kind of brushes and things about this high. A lot of people call it a brushy field. I call it a scrub field. So the units show up, they begin deploying. Ewell's division shows up first. He puts two brigades on the mountain, and Jubal Early, who drove off Bayard's cavalry, lines up here. Charles Winder's division, formerly the Stonewall Division, shows up next, and William Tullifer's brigade's here, Thomas Garnett's here, in what becomes a very unfortunate formation, and the Stonewall Brigade under Charles Ronald is in reserve. Artillery in these spots, and then on the Federal side, Crawford moves his whole, they were on either side of the road, they move up to this side, and then the 2nd Division fills in down here. Geary to the north, Prince, Greene. Greene's got a really small brigade and a bunch of artillery, and then Gordon's all the way up here. You have an artillery duel that starts about 3, 4 o'clock, and the Confederates actually are at a disadvantage for a number of pieces. They have 23 versus 36, although these 6 right here don't really count because they're not in any kind of position to be used. So 23 to 30, but the Federals get the worst of it because the Federals get the worst because the Confederates are in a much better position. Typically the ground's higher where they are. Charles Winder, however, gets a solid shot through his torso, and he is very quickly out of the action. So William Tullifer takes over the division, and his relative, Alexander Galt Tullifer, takes over that brigade. Tullifer doesn't really know what Winder's plan, or certainly doesn't know what Jackson's plan was. They were hoping for a flanking movement around this side, and Tullifer has sort of a defensive mindset, and he starts looking, okay, how do I secure myself here. So he sends the Stonewall Brigade over this way to try to find Garnett's left. And he also sends his own 10th Virginia to do the same thing. And they're both sort of meandering through dense woods, and it takes them a little bit too long. You have a conclave of officers here in Crawford's brigade determining what they want to do. They eventually asked for permission to charge because they think it'd be a really great thing to go get this battery. They don't really know what's out here. So some of the officers don't think they should be doing that. Crawford, Joseph Knipe think that they should. And the animated discourse is clear. The soldiers can see it, and they know they're about to have a charge. Banks eventually sends word for them to do that, also for a charge down here. The intent, they both land about the same time. It seems like Crawford's supposed to go first, but he actually lands slightly later. And in the meantime, you've got skirmishing going on. The 8th and 12th U.S. regulars are down here doing a really bang-up job drawing the attention of all these Confederates and covering the whole division. So Geary's brigade goes forward, Prince's first line goes forward, and Prince heads back for his second line. And Crawford's people, they get up over the fence into the corner or into the wheat field, bayonets fixed. They a couple hurrahs and they go. Meanwhile, you have 6 companies from the 3rd Wisconsin, Gordon's brigade, way up here, that Gordon had sent forward to do some reconnoitering. They were on this wood road right here, and the 46th Pennsylvania go right through their lines and keep going toward the wheat field. And eventually, Crawford sends Thomas Ruger, great future general, orders to follow him on this charge. And Ruger says, "I'm here under Gordon's orders," and basically tells him to pound sand. Orders from higher up eventually come and tell Ruger to join him. And he remembers, okay, 46th Pennsylvania went through my lines, so he shifts to the right and trying to uncover, and he ends up over here in the scrub field. Now, I'll get this a little bit more in a minute, but the traditional interpretation of this is that they go through the wheat field, but a number of sources point to them actually being in the scrub field. So I'll get back to that in a minute. So Crawford's people go forward without Crawford. Several sources say that he gives the order and then stays behind in the woods. So Dudley Donnelly is the de facto brigade commander. They go forward. 5th Connecticut gets a bit stalled. After 3 volleys, the 1st Virginia Battalion, 3 ineffective volleys, gets driven off by the 28th New York. 46th Pennsylvania pushes into the 10th Virginia before they get into place, and then swings. Things become a little bit unhinged in the woods, but they swing into the right of the Stonewall Brigade. 27th Virginia eventually falls back. So the 28th New York, once they get through here, they're able to swing around, and they get behind the rest of Garnett's brigade, who are paying attention to Geary and firing on him. So it allows the 5th Connecticut to surge forward and get into the woods too. And the 21st Virginia, the first intimation that they have that these Federals are behind them is when they get a volley at 20, 30 paces behind them into their backs. Things degenerate very quickly into a hand-to-hand fight. And meanwhile, the very first brigade from A.P. Hill's Corps shows up, Edward Thomas's Georgians, and they go down here, leaving the 14th Georgia behind to bolster Tullifer, which turned out to be very important. Oh, whoops. All right, so back to this 3rd Wisconsin detachment. I already explained that they are where they are. This drawing, actually, I'll put it back here for you. It's in, if you're looking at the OR at Thomas Ruger's report for Cedar Mountain, it mentions a drawing that he did, but it's not published in the OR. There it is from the National Archives. It's in the book. But it's really important, actually, because they've got this ridge here that several accounts talk about as the border between the wheat field and the scrub field. And what you have is a slight ridge on this map, 46 Pennsylvania, right? 3rd Wisconsin, right here. And then this disposition of the enemy pretty much matches what's well documented for the Stonewall Brigade as being right there. And if you read the Stonewall Brigade's accounts, they match all of this too. The Stonewall Brigade actually, and again, the traditional interpretation is Stonewall Brigade comes forward, wheels to the right, lines the border of these two fields, and then lays into the flank of the 3rd Wisconsin, who gets mauled and they leave, right? So if you read their accounts, though, they talk about, okay, well, we go forward, there's some force in front of us, we drive them off, and then we wheel to the right and fire into the people into the field. So in 2 to 3 minutes, this detachment loses 30% casualties. So, and here's in the same orientation as what you've got there. Okay, so I'm going to just pause really quickly and give you a little story time. So we'll start with the 28th New York. Lieutenant William Warren in the 28th New York. As they get into the wheat field, he sees Confederate colors on the other side of the field and encourages men to go get them. He raises his sword. Ball takes off the tip of his right index finger. And he wraps that in a handkerchief, keeps going. In a little while, another ball below his left elbow. Surgeons eventually take 13 pieces of bone out of that. And he goes a little bit further. He gets a ball in his head, takes a piece of his skull out, the ball does, and his face is covered in blood. He loses vision in one eye, but he keeps going. A little while later, another ball goes between his windpipe and his carotid artery and lodges at the base of his skull, and it swells like a basket, he says. And a little bit later, we'll get to this, but they're retreating back through the wheat field, and during that time, a ball goes through his left leg in the center, above the knee. That puts him on the ground. And he's there for 2 days, along with the rest of the wounded, out in this heat. There are varying stories of good and bad treatment of these guys. But so it's a mixed bag, like with most things. Okay, so that's his story. And the point of what I'm doing here is to give you some idea of the nature of the fighting at Cedar Mountain. So he's in the 28th New York, the 21st Virginia, into which they fire here in a little bit. You've got this private Roswell Lindsay. I keep wanting to say Roswell Ripley every time I do this. Lindsay, he bayonets a Yankee, and then he gets several shots into him. The first of which is from a Confederate captain, a federal captain, who is then bayoneted by several of Lindsay's comrades. So that's the kind of fighting that's going on in the woods. The sun's going down too. We're getting around 6 o'clock here. Sun's coming down, kind of dense woods, a lot of smoke. So much so even that Warren tells his men to get down on the ground to look for legs to shoot at because the smoke's so thick in there. But there's talk of rocks being thrown, fence rails, clubbed rifles, bayonets, the whole thing. And then to the 3rd Wisconsin, the picture here is of Captain Moses O'Brien, well-liked, capable officer. He's commanding one of these companies, and it's the last one to leave. When they leave, they go to this, 2.5 of the companies go to this ravine and shelter there in the woods. And he has a ball in his leg, blood filling his boot. He cuts his pant leg open and wraps a tourniquet around it. In a little bit, the rest of the brigade's going to come back through, pick these companies up, and come to the edge of the wheat field. And he's going to go and these people who've been through those high casualties are going to go back in again. And he gets shot through the body. And like Warren is on the field for 2 days. When the Federals get back onto the field during a truce, the surgeon tells him it's mortal. And his men don't want to have him go back in an ambulance because of the bumpy roads and fearing for him. So they carry him on a stretcher back to Culpeper. It's about 6-7 miles. And he ends up dying on a hotel porch. Okay, so let's talk about Geary's brigade for a second. The 7th Ohio peels off fairly early on under the fire that they had gotten kind of the worst of it at the beginning here. And then the 29th Ohio comes in, 5th Ohio fills in. When Prince rides back, brings these 2 regiments forward, he gives them explicit instructions about how to miss 3rd Maryland. 3rd Maryland says that they were fired into their backs by the 109th Pennsylvania. And this regiment peels off. 111th Pennsylvania soon peels off too. And they sort of oblique right a little bit and fill in. Thomas's Georgians are firing down this line, picking off 102nd New Yorkers from left to right. And I'll just give a quick quote from a 102nd New Yorker about their time in the cornfield. He called it a seething, burning, hell-ridden cornfield where the screech of shells, the ping of the bullets, and shouts of the men, together with the fearful havoc in our ranks, made it possible to imagine oneself in a veritable hell with the concomitant devil and all his imps. So that's what he thought it was like there. But things aren't great down here. One of the gunners in Dement's battery describes a rumbled roar and crackling like the noise of a mighty windstorm, smashing and breaking through the woods. That's Crawford's men coming out of the woods up here. Very soon, a rider comes up and tells them to limber to the rear. So these batteries limber and leave. And Crawford's people come out of the woods, and their physical advance is probably about this far. But they roll up Tullifer's brigade, they leave, and they roll up half of Jubal Early's brigade. Early's downhill placing Thomas at the time, comes back up, sees 2 of his regiments, and then nothing else for, almost a half a mile here to the woods. And so he sends people off to try to get that situation sorted, and he stays with them. So anchoring Jackson's right, the Stonewall Brigade, what's left of it, is anchoring his left, and you have this yawning gap in the center that gets unexploded. But the good news for him is, actually I'll get to that in a second, he comes over here into the woods, and there's the famous story of him raising his sword, it rusted in the scabbard, and saying, Jackson's here, come fight with me, all this. That's inspirational, these guys in Garnett's brigade, but didn't really turn the battle around. These units don't really do much for the rest of the battle. Pockets of them will join other units and participate in the battle again. But what's really turning things around is 14th Georgia is here, and they fire into what's left of Crawford's flank because they're very disorganized by this point. You have 2 other regiments here that sort of stay together. The 13th Virginia and 31st Virginia fall back a little bit, but they'll rally. And then you have A.P. Hill showing up. So Branch's brigade shows up here. And if you read his report, he talks about how they won the whole battle, but they're sort of mopping up too, to a certain extent. So Banks calls, he sees things are starting to unravel, and he calls on, starts making a couple swings, right? So he calls on Gordon's brigade, and they're not where he expects they are. And he calls on the 10th Maine. 10th Maine had been at Crawford's brigade. They'd been held back to guard a battery back here. And the battery eventually moves off, and they're left basically as a de facto bodyguard for Banks. He sends them in, and they're going in as Crawford's people are streaming back through here, trying to get away, with people telling the 10th Maine, you've got to get out of here, there are too many Confederates, stuff like that. And by the time they show up, Branch is lining the wheat field, Archer's approaching the wheat field, and the Stonewall Brigade's up here on this end. 5th Virginia had dove in and went back briefly. So the Colonel, George Beale's looking at this situation and saying, well, I can fight a lot better from this tree line right here. So he starts to move back. A staffer for Banks comes down, Louis Palouse, and says, nobody told you to leave. What are you doing? And Beale tries to explain himself. They have an argument right there under fire in front of, in the middle of this field. And their gesticulations to one of the people there they said it resembled that they were having a fist fight right out there in the field. And eventually Palouse says to Beale, well, if you're not going to fight this regiment, I will. I'll take it over for you. And Beale refuses that kind offer and says, no, I'll do it. But so there's a little bit of a ridge about a third of the way through the wheat field. He takes them there, has them get, the men lay down or kneel for the most part. And they say they're there for about 20 minutes. It's probably a little bit less than that, about 20 rounds they go through. And they eventually peel off here. And Gordon's people are coming. So Gordon had been told by Williams to keep an eye out for Williams. Williams would wave a handkerchief when it was time to go. And he never saw the handkerchief. Eventually he had as the firing was increasing, his men were getting up because they were all having a rest in the shade. And they were all getting up into line, ready to go. And, Gordon's looking through his glasses. Nothing. Eventually a staffer comes up and tells them to go. And they double quick down the hill. And then back up this very steep kind of hill right here through brambles and rocks and all sorts of things. And make it up here to the wheat field. So, shift you back down here again really quickly. I said about these stalwarts. They go forward and drive off Geary's brigade and then swing onto the Orange Road. Meantime, about the time 10th Maine's leaving and Gordon's showing up, John S. Clark sees these riders from the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry, and they are to charge down the Orange Road. And it's 4 companies, 164 mounts, and they come down the road into the wheat field just in time. These guys get along the road just in time to be on their flank as they land. So there's nothing they can do about these folks here. They're just firing into their flank, and they got Branch in front of them. So that turns into kind of a shambles. But psychologically, it does something to the Confederates. So now you're left with Gordon up here by himself on this end of the field, and Prince's 2 regiments down here by themselves. And Gordon's people actually do a pretty good job. 2nd Massachusetts is firing by files, and when Archer's men advance, the right actually gets stalled, and really the whole brigade gets stalled for a bit. But what happens is Pender's brigade gets led by one of Ronald's staffers behind the scrub field, and they line up on Gordon's flank and just march right down his flank, and that pretty much ends that. They all head back to the Brown Cottage, and these brigades, Confederate brigades, it's dark now, and they kind of continue going this way and don't see them. Branch goes in the cornfield. Early goes in the cornfield. These brigades come off the mountain, drive off Green, and these 2 regiments almost get trapped out here. Their brigade commander, Henry Prince, just before this happens, heads out this way looking for Augur. By this time, Augur is wounded and out of the battle. Geary's wounded and out of the battle. Prince comes up here looking for where he thinks he's going to find Augur, and he gets captured by the Confederates. So when you get into the Maryland campaign, you see a complete turnover with this division. Okay, so casualties for Cedar Mountain. So I'm not going to list all this, but note Crawford's brigade. And in Crawford's brigade, every field officer, commander, every adjutant is either killed, wounded, or captured. Crawford's doesn't have any wounds either, or himself. The whole corps gets pretty high casualties. These are pretty interesting statistics for the 28th New York. You have a result of all this. There's a high loss in company commanders. And what ends up happening is, after this battle, an effect of it is, these staffers from the brigade, division commands, they head back to company command because they're needed there. If you see, I mean, you've got a captain commanding one of these regiments. You have sergeants and corporals leading companies. So they have to go back there. That sort of hobbles coordination going forward, makes things very hard on the different commanders. And interestingly, one of those guys that goes from company or from brigade staff to company command is Robert Goldshaw, who would be in 54th Massachusetts. He had been in the 2nd Massachusetts, went up to Gordon's staff, came back down for Antietam. And Nathaniel Banks actually is wounded here too. A horse hits him very late, and he's in an ambulance for the rest of the campaign. Sort of command of the Corps shifts between him and Williams back and forth for the next 2-3 weeks. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take you to the end of this Virginia situation. So what happens is Banks' Corps goes back to Culpeper and is parked there by Pope. The rest of Pope's army goes down here to the Rapidan and is standing off of Jackson, sort of like no battle ever happened. But in the meantime, Robert E. Lee figures out that George McClellan's leaving the peninsula, and he shifts over here and joins Jackson. So, his great wish is to come to grips with Pope south of the Rappahannock. Pope gets intelligence that kind of what's up, and he's also getting a lot of chatter in his ear from Henry Halleck to not get too far from his source of supplies and reinforcements. And he packs up his show on the 18th, and heads back across the river. And Lee's watching his quarry get away, kind of disappointedly. So, and actually, a rear guard action is the Battle of First Brandy Station. I talk about it in the book. I'm not going to talk about it here, but it's happening right there. Okay, so there's a really interesting period from the 20th through the 25th where you had this standoff across the Rappahannock River. It doesn't get covered much. I get into some detail about it. I think it's very interesting. Each of the commanders have a strategic problem. Lee's problem is he needs to get across the river and fight Pope before McClellan shows up, or McClellan's army shows up. Pope's problem is he needs to prevent that, and he also needs to maintain contact downriver and with this railroad, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And the reason for that is that's where his reinforcements are coming from, both those two directions. So what ends up happening is Lee sidles upriver and does so kind of skillfully to not show any gaps, and he sort of crab walks up the river. And it stretches, and Pope has to stay down here. And it stretches Pope out, makes things very hard for him. And he kind of goes back and forth about what to do. And I'm going to talk about August 22nd because it's a really interesting day, and briefly about the 23rd. So a couple things happen on the 22nd. First of all, the Second Corps is down here at Norman's Ford at the beginning of the day, and they're doing under an artillery duel. And these are happening all along the line every day, and there's a lot of that. First thing in the morning, a rider comes up, asks Gordon some questions. The result of that is he gets under arrest. Pope had figured out that he had submitted some information to an AP reporter and wasn't really pleased about it. By midday, he was back in command of his brigade. Ruger and some other people interceded. Anyway, so that's happening down there. Here, kind of around Freeman's Ford, Sigel's Corps is making a series of probes across the river, and Henry Boland's brigade gets across, and they get mauled by the back end of Jackson's column and the front end of Longstreet's column. And what results is something very similar to Ball's Bluff, because it's high ground there by the river, and they're trying to get back across it, and you have guys getting shot in the river and stuff like that. And that's in plain sight of pretty much everybody in this corps. Some of them actually go to try to assist. And then eventually, Jackson's wing of the Confederate Army find open fords, which they had trouble doing the past couple of days. And he gets Jubal Early across on a decrepit dam, and Lawton's brigade's supposed to go across. The 13th Georgia's the only brigade that gets across, or the only regiment of that brigade that gets across, and he gets a couple sections of artillery to get across. And then a freshet breaks over the Rappahannock River Valley, and it rises 18 feet. And so now Jubal Early's stuck on the wrong side of the river for a day and a half, which is really bad news. It's one of the few times Stonewall Jackson seems kind of nervous about something, because he spends the next day sitting his horse in the river watching AP Hill's engineers work on making a new bridge. Good news is they don't really know. The Federals know there's something, they're over here somewhere, but they don't know where. Somewhere between here and Waterloo Bridge. They eventually, so Sigel starts heading up this way, Banks follows, and then eventually McDowell will follow too. And this is the same day that Lee tells Jeb Stuart that he can do his raid around to Catlett Station because he's having trouble. So Stuart goes kind of all the way like that. All right, and then on the 23rd, there's this really massive artillery duel, probably the biggest one of the campaign, at Beverly Ford and Rappahannock Station. And this is Longstreet's people. You've got Gordon's brigade supporting Cothran's battery here. Cothran gets the best of the Confederates there. And then you actually have some Federals on this side, on the south side of the river, and they get attacked and eventually come back across the river. They burn the bridge, and then McDowell goes on his way to Warrenton and then to come towards here from the north. This is really a diversion to divert Pope's gaze away from up here and to basically secure Longstreet's further sidle upriver, right? So he wants to kind of put them on their heels and then go. Okay, so all that sort of stays static, though, until the 25th. Lee can't really get across the river. He wants to do it this side of the Bull Run Mountains. He couldn't do it. So he sends Jackson on a big flank march. You're probably all familiar with that. That ends up behind Pope and results in Second Manassas here. Pope doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't know where Jackson's going. John S. Clark is the guy who sends the message up to Pope that he's moving because he sees him. But so Pope sort of goes in different directions for a little bit, and then his men are marching all over the place. This is actually my favorite map in the book. It's, the joke in my house is it's punishingly intricate. So if you have a little time and some coffee, it'd be great. But you see here, you have some Army of the Potomac showing up, as well as the Army of Virginia and Army of Northern Virginia. There's a lot going on here, and it's down to the division level. So not going to talk about Second Manassas. From the 25th onward, the Second Corps becomes increasingly detached from the rest of the Army. And so kind of goes the story here, except for some context. But so they end up, and this is their path from Waterloo. Actually, there they are. They kind of go this way, okay? And they're following Fitzjohn Porter's corps up the railroad and relieve him. So when Jackson had come this way, he destroyed a couple of bridges, and there were railroad cars trapped on the wrong side of the bridges, filled with property, millions of dollars of property. And Pope's opinion was that Banks' corps was not really fit for anything, and so he posted them there and basically wasn't going to allow them to participate in the battle. So, but the logistical situation is really downright terrible for this corps in particular. It's bad for everybody. They left their knapsacks on the 19th in the wagons and sent those, and he didn't see them again until they got into Maryland, like the 8th of September. So they didn't have a change of clothes, they didn't have anything. And most of the time, they didn't have anything to eat. So I'm going to give you a couple quotes here really quickly. The men are terribly jaded, literally half-starved and in great want of meat. We're dirty and becoming lousy again. This constant marching and counter-marching to no apparent purpose is aggravating in the extreme. An Indiana soldier, one of their problems was they were following, this country had been stripped clean, but what made it worse was they were following Siegel's Corps into this barren country, and anything that was left, Siegel's Corps was taking. So there was literally nothing left for these guys to take, right? But in a abandoned knapsack in a wagon, this Indiana soldier found 2 bites of the grossest, fattest pork I ever saw, and also a small handful of moist, dirty cracker crumbs. But it was the sweetest morsel I ever ate. And a New Yorker wrote that the only water available was no better than could be obtained from a stagnant swamp hole. Many of the men had dysentery and low fevers. Finally, this is from Pope. Banks' corps is very weak, not amounting to more than 5,000 men, is much demoralized. Banks' corps must be left somewhere in the rear to be set up again. And that's what I described there. That's what happens. So as the battle's going on, they can hear the battle. Banks actually telegraphs and says, is what we're doing really that important? Do you want us to go participate in this battle? The answer from Halleck in Washington comes back, yes, unless you have orders, go up and join Pope. And Pope's chief of staff, Colonel Ruggles, responds then after that's like, no, you have positive orders, stay put. And so kind of that's what happens. And then this battle goes very badly. And so they 29th and 30th. On the 30th, the Pope's army starts heading towards Centerville. He sends orders via rider to Banks to destroy the property and head to Centerville via Brentsville. Right? So they were here, Bristow Station. Brentsville's down here, and Centerville's up here. So they're telling them to go march a bunch of miles out of their way before heading up that way. And the idea is that they're potentially under threat. So this little corps, who's not in any kind of sufficient condition to join in this battle with the rest of the army, is now potentially trapped with a victorious Confederate host in between them and the army. So the situation's pretty dire. What makes it worse is the rider gets lost on the night of the 30th, and he shows up the morning of the 31st. So now all these extra hours have passed, and so they set fire to the trains, and they set off. And the 2nd Massachusetts, this really professional regiment, are in the lead, setting the pace, and it's a grueling pace. Nobody straggles, though, because they understand the gravity of the situation. Horses actually collapse and are just unharnessed and left to die. And there's actually some more rain, so there are a couple streams they have to cross, and those are rising kind of rapidly. So there's some concern about that. But they make it more or less uneventfully to Centerville. Tom Rosser's cavalry comes down to Manassas Junction, captures a few of them, but that's pretty much it. The Confederate infantry is going around the other flank, and which results in Chantilly on the 1st. So they get up here into Centerville, and they see they get the news of the battle, and then they're the water's tainted by slaughtered animals, and there's animal offal all over the place, and kind of a bad situation. But the whole army takes off on the 1st, heading back this way towards Washington. And like I said, Chantilly happens that evening, and they're standing in the road when that thunderstorm breaks, and they stay there until dark, and then are kind of bivouacking in the woods. They're not allowed to set fires. It's an uncharacteristically or colder than usual night, and everybody's pretty miserable. There's actually a little game of people setting fires and people telling them to put them out and kind of going around like that. So when the sun comes up the next morning, they are very anxious to get back to Washington. So they set out on the march again. The 28th Pennsylvania, actually, 2 interesting things. They had been sent back to Blackburn's Ford to destroy the crossing there and then follow. And also on the 1st, a detachment of the 28th Pennsylvania, right here, that's them, a handful of infantrymen set out on this really interesting reconnaissance mission that if I ever come back and talk about the second half of the book, I'll tell you all about it, or we can talk about it later on. But I don't have time right now. But it's really kind of interesting. So that happens, and then also as the Army, or as the Corps is waiting here for other corps to pass, they're expecting, very close to the forts, they're expecting, okay, the campaign's almost over, their spirits are coming up, and get a really good demonstration of how when expectations change quickly, you just get really demoralized. So one of Banks' staffers comes up and tells Gordon, okay, your brigade is going to head back to Fairfax and collect secure government stores. So the dejection all over his men's face is just complete, right? And he asks, okay, well, which Fairfax? Fairfax Courthouse or Fairfax Station? Because they're each 6 miles away and 4 miles apart. And they didn't have an answer. He went and asked Banks. Banks didn't know, sitting in his ambulance. And he says, well, go to Fairfax Courthouse first, and if it's not there, go to Fairfax Station. And, the Confederates are thought to be there by now, and Jeb Stuart's cavalry is here. So they head back, and I'm going to kind of cut to the chase a little bit, but they end up turning around and coming back. Gordon went back to Banks again and asked again, and he wouldn't let him out of it. But they end up leaving. So everybody sort of straggles into the forts, Fort Ward, Fort Worth, that area for this corps, about 2 a.m. in the morning on the 3rd of September, and their campaign is over. Just give you two more quotes really quickly. So John Meade Gould, Antietam people know about him. He said, the men dropped as if they were shot, the darkest day and the darkest hour in our regimental history. This is from Wilder Dwight, the lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Massachusetts. It has been so tense and corrosive that I am not yet in tone to write on account of it. Disaster, pitiable, humiliating, contemptible. And this Ohio private wrote, we suffered, but we have become inured to hardships, which, in my opinion, sums up the first half of this book really well and sets up, puts in proper context what happens in the second half, which is a great deal of success at Antietam that's unexploited. And it's really interesting given everything that happened prior to this, or prior to going into Maryland. So thank you very much. I'm not going to read that quote, but I think it's great. It's from a member of the 102nd New York, one of the captains. And if anybody's read Herodotus, you'll think it's funny. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, be happy to. And if anybody wants to nerd out on Antietam afterwards, too, I'd be happy to do that. Okay.
Way back in the front, there was with Banks and all of his staff.
Right.
I just had a C picture go, and you just went by.
Yeah, got to catch up.
That one.
There you go.
Is there, are all those officers identified somewhere?
Not to me.
Not yet. Okay.
So this is, I think, a little bit earlier than the scope of this book, though, because I'm pretty sure I know who that guy is. And he, if it's who I think it is, he had a very interesting episode with Abraham Lincoln, where he.
George is standing next to Banks.
No, this is Banks's staff. Yeah, actually, it's probably a little big, but yeah, no, the brigade division commanders are not in this picture. Yep.
I've been under the impression that Nathaniel Banks had actually fought Cedar Mountain fairly well. Got a good hit into Jackson and seemed to do some real damage before the rest of Jackson's wing came up. You're not going entirely against that, but you definitely are playing on the fact that he probably didn't play it off or fight it as well as he thought he fought it.
Yeah, so the coordination left a little bit to be desired. And his understanding of where his guys were on the field, right? Those two things combined really hindered him. the Corps, it's, really Crawford's brigade came very close to defeating Stonewall Jackson all by itself, and without a brigade commander, it turns out. But, had there been a little bit more support there, had Ricketts been brought up, things like that. So he didn't communicate what he was doing to Pope either very well. Pope was smoking on a porch in Culpeper until late in the day. And so all those sorts of things sort of combined and so Jackson it wasn't really a good battle for Jackson either. So it's kind of screw-ups all around in a sense, right? And then the end result is you have these two armies facing each other across the river, and it's not much changed, just a bunch of casualties.
Do you have any thoughts on why the communications between Pope and the Corps and the divisions were so bad in this campaign?
Well, it's a good question. Banks simply wasn't communicating back to Pope. So Pope didn't really have a good idea of how far advanced things were. And he didn't, it seems he didn't feel Banks could call on Ricketts. And maybe there's something to that. The Banks also, and I get into this in the book, Banks is a little bit rash in launching this, and there'd be some post-war arguments on that point. But there's a lot to be said for him being concerned about public opinion. Because first Winchester went really badly, right? And they sort of did a skedaddle back to Maryland. And in that period when Pope is coaching, leading up to Orange Courthouse, he's saying things to Banks like, we are going to do nothing but advancing. We are going to attack. We're going to let them worry about defending. And he was saying specific comments to Banks that were kind of personal. And the whole thing was very, Joff, kind of World War I. We're gonna just attack kind of stuff. And so he did that. And then, the day before the battle, that Roberts guy was also, or his day of the battle, he was saying comments like that to Banks too. So all those things taken together, Banks was like, we're going to attack, right? And it wasn't really the smartest move to do it. But he caught Jackson off guard. Really what he did was took advantage of, unbeknownst to him, took advantage of a really bad disposition for Thomas's brigade. But interestingly, Gordon's brigade set up just like that at, at least 2nd Massachusetts set up just like that at Antietam, and turns out really well. But sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, I guess. Sir?
Forgot the officer's name that was lost his fingertip.
William Warren.
Did he survive?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Incredible.
Yeah. And so, one of the Confederates put a blanket over him to shield him from the sun, gave him water. Other ones, they were stealing stuff off of not only dead people, but living people, which people thought was not the best thing to do. But there's that kind of mixed bag. There's both of those kinds of accounts. Oh, back in the back.
Just trivia, Banks was stationed here in Frederick in 61.
And the 3rd Wisconsin actually swept into town and scooped up a bunch of delegates who were going to vote on seceding. So that's kind of interesting. Yes, sir.
Even though Banks didn't take part in the Second Manassas, it was shortly thereafter that the Second Corps was changed to the 12th. Mm-hmm. Banks was out and Mansfield was in. Banks' idea, Lincoln's idea, whose idea was it for Banks to be going?
Good question. So a major part of it was he was injured, right? He wasn't mobile during the campaign. Almost entirely was in an ambulance. So he took over the defenses when McClellan then took the army and went. And it was Williams had the Corps for the first week and a half until the 15th. And that's an interesting story. If I have a minute, I'll do I have okay. So so Williams actually loses the Corps on September 14th, the day of South Mountain, and he misses a meeting he's supposed to have in Middletown with McClellan, and he's out the next day. But McClellan was already looking for, on the 13th, had a staffer reading off names, trying to get a replacement for Williams. Because he didn't have a high opinion of Williams, he wanted him out. And, Mansfield was already on his way. So I think it was the meeting to say, hey, you're losing command of this corps. I don't think it was because of it, but it's an interesting episode. But it wasn't Lincoln, because, Lincoln put him back in the War Department, Lincoln, whoever, put him back for, Port Hudson, and he commanded the Louisiana Department for a while and stuff like that. So he wasn't out of favor or anything. Anything else?
Well, one more round of applause, I think. Again, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Chris has some of his books in the back, so definitely check those out. Can you stick around and maybe do some signings for us?
I'd love to. And thank you
Fantastic.
very much for having me. It's great questions.
And we're going to be having Ron Kirkwood next month, for our next meeting. He'll be talking about his new book, Too Much for Human Endurance, looking at the Spangler Farm at Gettysburg. So hope you can join us for that. Have a great night, guys. Thanks for coming out.